Hi everyone, I'm here with Radhika Desai. Radhika is professor at the University of Manitoba. She is director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, and she's author of the book Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. And I would posit that there aren't many people in the world that understand Marx's Capital better than she does. I also worked with Radhika on the No Cold War campaign, and it was actually her who persuaded me that it was well beyond time for me to read Capital myself, and she suggested that I start by joining a Capital reading group. I took that advice. I'm a few weeks into that journey, and the online group that I joined has persuaded me that I should interview Radhika for some inspiration and some insight on Capital, following up on the recent interview I did with Vijay Prashad, and she's very kindly agreed to that. So that's what we're doing today. Radhika, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Hopefully 2021 will be, I hope against hope that 2021 will be better than 2020.
Yeah, well, just hoping that the pandemic respects such matters as the Earth's circumnavigation of the sun. So let's start with some outlines and some inspiration. I wanted to ask, because so many people are intimidated by the idea of reading Capital, and I've had people say to me, this with modern concentration spans and priorities, that's just not something people do these days. So in your experience, how difficult is Capital? Did you struggle with it the first time round? And do you have any tips for getting through it?
I think that, well, the first thing you have to remember about Capital is that it was, at the end of the day, serialized in a workers' newspaper. So it isn't that hard to read. I think people find it hard going because we, especially those of us who've been to university, and also, of course, whether we've been to university or not, we participate in a broader understanding of how the economy works, which is essentially highly ideological. It comes from neoclassical economics and so on. And so because our minds are already addled by neoclassical economics, which emerged a few years after Capital Volume 1 was published, precisely in order to oppose the sorts of things that are in it, it has essentially shifted the entire ground of the discourse from where it was when classical political economy was around and Marx essentially brought it to a new and I would say definitive culmination, to something completely different. So now, if you have generations growing up who learn neoclassical economics, so then when they open Capital, they don't understand what's happening in there. And I would say the most important thing that you can do to make it easy for you to understand Capital is to lay outside the door, leave at the door your neoclassical economics understanding. I know it's hard because it's in your head. It's not like you can take it out of your head and leave it outside the door. But if you know that and you counteract it and simply follow what Marx is actually saying, rather than what he might be saying, which might fit into the neoclassical framework, you'll be fine.
To know any preliminary reading people should do? Should they read David Harvey first? Should they read Ben Fine first?
Right. I would say, well, I have to say that I would say that a lot of these people who are sort of regarded as great star Marxists, we'll come to that about that later. There are these Marxist economists, or for that matter, Marxist geographers. I would say that a lot of their interpretations have been too colored by neoclassical economics. So I would suggest that if you want to read anything as a preliminary, the best thing to do is actually to read the introductions that Ernest Mandel has written to the various volumes, the 3 volumes of Capital published in the Penguin or NLB version, the New Left Books version. I think Ernest Mandel was one of the few people who, although he called himself a Marxist economist, he did not in fact fall prey to the tendency to try to fit Marxism into the neoclassical mold. So he remains exempt from it. And I would say that his introductions are very good. If you really want to read something as a preliminary, read that. And it's not that long. I mean, it's no longer than some of the chapters in Capital. So that would be that's perfectly adequate as an introduction.
Right. And you mentioned neoclassical economics arising essentially in response to Marxism. To what extent does Keynesianism fit into that framework?
Very good point. My goodness. This is such an important point. So, first of all, let me say that when I teach about Marxism, not exactly every year, but certainly around every other year, I give a course to a third year level class on Marxism. Because that reaches more people rather than teaching a graduate course, you see. One of the things I always say to my classes on this point is that I consider Marx to be the greatest analyst of capitalism ever, and also, of course, the greatest analyst of capitalism in the 19th century, and Keynes to be the greatest in the 20th century. Of course, Keynes is to me intellectually slightly less than Marx in a certain way. But what's remarkable about Marx and Keynes is that if you account for the fact that Marx was a real revolutionary, Keynes was a member of the establishment, Marx thought that the only way we could change capitalism is by having a revolution against the order, the legal structures and the political order of capital, whereas Keynes, throughout his life, harbored the hope that he would convince the people in authority to do the sensible things that he was saying. Well, so Keynes is different in that way. Keynes is a member of the establishment. Keynes identified as a bourgeois. But if you take all these things into account and then look at what Keynes was saying, his analysis is remarkably similar to Marx's. Because and you know, I have also written actually about the first book that Keynes wrote, his 1913 Indian Currency and Finance, which is a very important and interesting study in itself. So when he's writing that, he is still relatively uncritical as a young economist. He's uncritical. He has not arrived at those realizations that would make him an ever more fundamental critic of capitalism, right up the way until 1936, when he writes the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. But this is a journey that Keynes undertook. And soon after the First World War, it became very clear to him that you cannot run a productive national economy without taking into interest the interest of the working class. So the working class and preserving full employment and having greater equality of incomes, etc., became critical to him. And these were, as Michal Kaletsky pointed out, Keynesian demands or Keynesian proposals could not be realized precisely because we lived in a capitalist economy. Capitalists do not tolerate full employment very easily because it strengthens workers' bargaining power too much. But of course, we know that Keynes didn't, you know, Keynes thought he would persuade people, elite people, and this was not going to happen. So that was his major failing. But in terms of his understanding of what was wrong with capital, and capitalism, he was very close to Marx. A couple more things. Number one, if you think about it, he identified two sources of crises and contradictions in capitalism, which are dead close to Marx. Number one, aggregate demand is a problem. Aggregate demand can never be assured in capitalism. Keynes and Marx agree on this. Number two, that over time, not necessarily in a crisis-inducing fashion on its own, but over time, the rate of profit tends to fall. Keynes called it the declining marginal efficiency of capital. That this will eventually lead to a point when there is a surfeit of capital, making capitalism itself obsolete. But he knew that. So that's the first point, is that in these ways, and I have actually an article which I'm happy to share, which shows how Marx and Keynes were so similar, because there are many other counts on which they are similar. The second thing I want to say is that, you know, Marx's, you know, you told me, Carlos, that you are 2/3 of the way into Capital. And I would say that you've already read the most important parts, because in a certain sense, Capital is front end loaded. You have to make sure you fully understand the beginnings. The rest is a cruise. The rest is a cruise, okay? Make sure you understand part one and the rest will be easy. In this beginning of Capital, you already find the distinction that Marx makes between what he calls the circuit of commodities and the circuit of capital. This is a very pregnant distinction. It is filled with things that, filled with reasons why you will constantly go back to this. And one of them is that a ordinary exchange economy, like an economy in which small producers produce and they exchange what they have for what they don't have. This is not capitalism, because the purpose of that economy is to fulfill needs. So you may have produced something, even a commodity, but your point is that you will exchange it in favor of a commodity that you need, and you give away something you don't need. So it goes CMC. So you begin with a commodity and you end with a commodity. The circuit of capital is the opposite. It is, and it's opposite in two ways. It begins with M, goes to C, and then closes with M dash or M prime, however you say it. I say M dash. So MC M dash. Now, there are two differences. It begins with M and it ends with a increase in M. CMC exchanges quality. I give away my shirt and I get a shoe or a pair of shoes. But in the second one, MCM dash, I start with money, I give it away only in order to get more money. So it's a quantitative distinction. Keynes considered this to be a stroke of genius. And in fact, he knew that when in his critique, when he started writing the general theory as a critique of the neoclassical economics that he had learned, he initially started writing it in terms of a critique of Say's law. By the way, both Marx and Keynes were also great critics of Say's law, and also great critics of comparative advantage. But anyway, so he wants to start with a critique of Say's law, and this is where he brings in Marx's critique, and he only abandons this draft of the general theory because he realizes that the Say's law has taken a new form. It has taken a new form in neoclassical economics, which did not exist in Marx's time. So he has to construct his critique in a new form. And so that is why he abandons it. But there are huge similarities between Marx and Keynes. So, and to me, you asked about neoclassical economics and Keynes. So a couple more points. So neoclassical economics gives, Keynes is trained in neoclassical economics, but just as Marx engaged in a critique of the classical political economy he inherited, Keynes engages in a critique of the neoclassical economics he inherits. So to me, and interestingly enough, neoclassical economics emerges in circa 1817, the so-called marginalist revolution. But early on, of course, it faces some resistance by not necessarily from Marxists. We will go into that later, but the various forms from Marxists, from the historical school, etc. So it is just beginning to get going, and then along comes Keynes and makes a devastating critique of it. And of course, since that time, also anti-neoclassical traditions, Keynes, Polanyi, Kalecki, Minsky, they're all of these in differing ways and in differing degrees, they are critical of neoclassical economics. So there is that tradition that already exists, and really because of the dominance of not exactly actual Keynesianism, but what Joan Robinson called a bastard Keynesianism in the post-Second World War period, really neoclassical economics actually really gets its heyday only with the rise of neoliberalism. So that's how I would understand. So Keynes, in fact, was a big blocker in terms of the influence of pure neoclassical economics. So you really begin to see that only in the neoliberal period.
Right, interesting. Because I suppose Keynesianism tends to be associated with a relatively more progressive, a relatively more worker-friendly section of the ruling class of the bourgeoisie. But at the same time, there's, politically speaking, there can be some overlap between Keynesianism and Marxism, in the sense that in terms of pursuing a progressive political project, a project that that includes both reformist and revolutionary elements, then you take on board the revolutionary nature of Marx, the need to dismantle capitalism, the need to dismantle a society based on classes and private ownership of the means of production. But you also take on board these things from Keynes around regulation and refinement of the capitalist system, such that you make it possible for people to live in the here and now, even prior to a revolution.
And more than that, I mean, I totally agree with what you said, but I would add one other thing. And that is that, it is very, Marxists often, they distinguish themselves as Marxists by saying, oh, Keynes was just a reformist. That's actually not true, because if you read what he proposed should be done with capitalism, although he never said, I am a revolutionary, if you actually did what he recommended, it would no longer be capitalism. This is what you have to remember. So he just didn't know quite how to do it. He was, he was just not sufficiently, anyways. So in fact, and by the way, a whole lot of mainstream writers, including also mainstream writers who will invoke Keynes as and when necessary. Especially after 2009, for example, Robert Skidelsky's biographer wrote, Keynes was back, and he even wrote a little book about it and so on. But in fact, Keynes, they cannot afford to bring back Keynes. There will always be a bastard Keynes as far as the elite is concerned. It's only the more radical sections of society who will see that Keynes said at one point that, he says at the conclusion of the general theory, something that's very relevant today, because we keep thinking about the elites essentially have confined themselves to monetary policy as the only way of trying to rectify the present crisis. And Keynes says in it very, very clearly that yes, monetary policy will help now and then, but eventually, he says, a time will come when it will no longer work. The expression is used, pushing on a string. It's apocryphal in the sense that it was not necessarily Keynes who used it, but it's a very good analogy, because he did say that essentially it would become like pushing on a string. Strings are great if you pull on them. They're useless if you push on them. So monetary policy will become like that. And when that happens, and we have been there now for quite a long time in many parts of the world, when that happens, he says, that a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment will be necessary. What is a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment when it's at home, in its slippers and smoking its pipe? It is socialism, right? So, Keynes, and this is there in the final chapter, in the concluding chapter, where he's bringing all his thoughts together. This is what he says, and these sort of, as I said, Joan Robinson's term, these bastard Keynesians, they don't recognize it. They would rather hide it away. Oh, did he really say that? What did he mean, do you think? Etc.
Right, that's fascinating. Are you able to tell us something about the background to Capital? It took Marx, 20 years to write the first volume. Volumes 2 and 3 didn't get completed until after his death. Why did he feel compelled to put that level of effort in? What was the gap in the market, if you'll pardon the capitalist metaphor?
The gap in the market, certainly, yeah, or the gap in knowledge, shall we say. I mean, it's really interesting. If you read the Communist Manifesto, which was written in 1848, in time for the, just as the revolutions of 1848 were getting going. And it's quite interesting from today's point of view, particularly because there are so many Marxists, who are like constantly waiting for capitalism to mature everywhere in the world. They're not being Marxists at all, because the young Marx and the young Engels, and by the way, part of the background to Capital is that you have to always remember Engels got there first. He did not just write in 1844, I think, the condition of the working class in England, but he also wrote an outline of a critique of political economy. So Engels is the person who introduces Marx to all this. And anyway, the analysis of the Communist Manifesto is pretty dead on in terms of understanding capitalism and what it does in broad terms. And you must remember that Marx and Engels really hoped that this revolution would succeed. What would that mean? That would mean that capitalism would have been smothered in its European cradle. It would be like the Chinese response to Wuhan, to the virus in Wuhan. They say, okay, just close down Wuhan and kill the virus there before it spreads to the rest of China and the rest of the world. And that's kind of what Marx and Engels are saying. Look, folks, this is a terrible system. Let's extinguish it. Let's snuff it out here so that it does not spread to the rest of the world and spread the misery, etc. So they had really hoped that capital would that capitalism would be dead by the end of the revolutionary period. But they were, of course, disappointed. They were sorely disappointed, and this was the disappointment that kind of at the and as they experienced this disappointment, they said, okay, folks, it's back to the drawing board. We have to understand this system, which seems to have more staying power than we had imagined, that it is not so easy to overcome and overpower, and let's try to understand how it works. And then Marx engages in the long labors of understanding capitalism, and the method he chooses is also very interesting. He does not say, okay, I'm going to do a study, what is being produced, how is it being produced, etc. I'm going to construct my understanding through a critique of existing understandings. So then he takes up that body of thought, which we call classical political economy, which is essentially should be understood as, people sort of scratching their heads as capitalism is emerging from its earliest days. What is going on? What is this new system? Is it going to work? Is it good for people? Is it just? Is it moral? Is it all these things, And all of these questions are all wrapped up in this. And so Marx begins to read this giant literature, and as luck would have it, after in the aftermath of the 1848 revolutions, he's hounded out of Germany into France, out of France into Belgium, and eventually he arrives in London, where he works at the British Library, where he finds, which is very conducive because it has all the literature that he could possibly want to read. So the disappointment leads to this systematic study, and the system of the study is to take the form of a critique of the existing body of thought up to his time, from the very beginnings up to his time of Capital. So, you were going to say, is it difficult to read and all those? So what is it like to read Capital? And one of the things I love to point out to anybody who is interested is that, in Capital, it's like, you have the text running along the top, and often you have footnotes that are as big, if not bigger, than the text itself on that page. That is the second commentary. And I would say never miss reading the footnotes. They are as interesting, and they will help you to understand, because Marx is exceedingly scrupulous. Marx always references even the most unknown person. If he got an idea from somebody, even though that person may be a nobody and nobody's going to discover that Marx got the idea, he wants to record it. I think there are several reasons for it. Partly, of course, that he is very scrupulous, but partly also because, in a certain sense, he wants to say this was known such a long time ago. So consider a very simple matter like the socially necessary labor. That the amount of labor that is that present technological advancement requires should go into any product. He, this is, he could have easily said, this is my idea, etc. No, he referenced an anonymous pamphlet from the 18th century, which has already arrived at this idea as though it is known already. And that's the other thing. You say, is it difficult to read? The fact of the matter is that many of the basic concepts are generally known to the world and known and debated in the world before neoclassical economics comes along. And it is only because neoclassical economics addles our minds that we fail to understand. So if you read Marx, read what he actually says, not try to interpret it in neoclassical terms, the economics terms, and remember to read everything. It will be quite fascinating, and you will see it's an evolving understanding. And Marx is, and also of course Marx is the other reason to read it very good. Few other reasons to read it very carefully. Number one, Marx is a great stylist. So his language is absolutely amazing, and also the vivid imagery. So for example, you have read that wonderful passage. I really treat in fact, if you look on YouTube, there's a video of it, of me giving a lecture on the passages regarding the hidden abode of production versus the noisy sphere of the market. I mean, it's a very vivid way of portraying the basic concept that he wishes to say, which is that in the market, everything is above board in the light of the sun, and everything is fair and square, and, or at least seems fair and square, or can be fair and square. But here's where actual exploitation takes place, in the hidden abode of the market. Sorry, in the hidden abode of production, where there is a sign which says no admittance except on business, etc., etc. So there is that. There are these various passages where capital is likened to a vampire. And I almost think you can do a sort of opera based on these beautiful scenes and vignettes, which would convey so much of the, in fact, you can ask your group whether they want to join together in writing an opera libretto, and then we can do other things. But anyway, so the style is great. And the second thing is, boy, if you ever met Marx, you wanted to make sure you were not on the wrong side of a tongue lashing by Marx, because the way in which he excoriates, whether it is Malthus or Nass or Senior, or even sometimes Ricardo, who he otherwise regarded as a great. So for all these reasons, it's an extremely enjoyable read. I would say, you say attention span, but I hear that actually COVID is once again lengthening our attention spans, and more of us are back to reading. So I'm not too worried about that. If it grabs your interest, you're going to stay with it, and it will be far more fascinating than a gazillion other things that you're going to do. So basically, if you're someone who wants to understand what's wrong with our system, a huge part of the answer is in Capital. So that's who should read it. Yeah.
Right. And that feeds into a sort of stereotyped comment that a lot of people make, that, well, this book was written over 150 years ago, and it describes presumably very well the economic relations that prevailed in 1867. To what extent do those economic relations prevail now in 2021?
Well, that question can be answered at many different levels. I mean, certainly there will be a lot of people who will say that many of the things that Marx predicted in that, whether it is the at the world level, certainly the impoverishment of the working people, the increasing concentration of capital, etc. I mean, there's a whole load of things, and there are more which we can go into as well. For example, people say Marx did not take into account the environment. Actually, if you read the sections on rent in volume 3, you will see that Marx says right at the beginning, he says, actually, you cannot manage the land under capitalist ownership structures. There can be no rational management of the land, and therefore of the earth, under capitalist ownership structures. He is there on everything. So I would say that Marx was prescient. Eric Hobsbawm points this out in the introduction that he wrote to the 150th anniversary edition of the Communist Manifesto, that Marx and Engels' account of capitalism, even in the manifesto, was so prescient, because if you think about it, in 1848, there was hardly a substantial working class in being, right? So they are looking so far forward that I would say that, so that's one level of the answer to the question. But there is actually another level which I find myself thinking about all the time. So first of all, you need to understand that Marx stands as Marx is the culmination of a long tradition of understanding capitalism, and that's classical political economy. Through his critique, he resolves its contradictions, its puzzles, its antinomies, and he gives a very high level integration, which is also very prescient, because if you got to the root of something, then it remains valid, even though other things overlay it, that element is still there. So, and I think you have that. So you have to see Marx as a culmination of classical political economy, but also you cannot understand what was written after Marx without knowing what Marx said, because so much of it, perhaps the overwhelming majority of it, was either written in support of him, or, well, actually there are three possibilities: in knowing support of him, in savvy support of him, in mistaken support of him, and of course, all the mainstream writing is in opposition to him, whether it is good faith opposition or bad faith opposition, it doesn't matter. But so you can't really know what Weber was trying to do, or what unless you understand what Marx was trying to do. And so so much of what has passed since then that's part of the reason why Marx is still relevant. If you think about it, the Communist Manifesto is one of the most widely read works in the world. Capital is less widely read only because it is such a big book and, as you say, an intimidating book, or at least it appears to be intimidating, or it has the effect of intimidation, but it should not have that. I mean, say it's a 1,000-page book. Well, that's 350-page books. So, are you, and it's an easy replacement. Any day that you can, any reading list, even with some of the most important works on it, I'll be happy to check out 3 books for you, which you should not read, and read Capital instead. So unless you are somebody who never reads, I think you should read this. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, reading Capital Volume 1, he introduces some of the contradictions which seem so impossible to a casual observer, that under this system of capitalism, we have these extraordinary advances in science and technology and in productivity and in machinery, and yet that's accompanied by a lengthening of the working day, or an increase in unemployment, or an increase in impoverishment of ordinary people. How could that be possible? And Marx shows you in an extremely detailed and extremely clear way how that's possible, what the mechanics of all that are. So how does neoclassical economics respond to that? Marx has brought, it feels like Marx brings clarity, and then neoclassical economics comes along and brings and obscures all of that.
Exactly.
So back to square one.
It simply muddies the waters. I mean, here's another thing that you have to bear in mind. What is different in the account of capitalism that is given in the best of classical political economy and in Marx, as opposed to neoclassical economics? Well, I would say that in Capital, or in classical political economy and in Marx, and Marx is clearest about this, but there are elements of this in classical political economy, capitalism is historically distinct, in the sense that it's not that, oh, markets have always existed, so capitalism has always existed, or that something called the economy has always existed. No, capitalism arises at a distinct point in history. It was not always here. It only arises when certain conditions are created, and we'll go back to that in a second. And it is fated to expire, so to speak, because it has its own contradictions, or it's certainly a very contradictory system. So, and when Marx says capitalism is historically distinct, most people think of it as involving stages. There was feudalism, there was primitive communism, then you have feudalism, then you have capitalism, then you'll have socialism, as Karl Polanyi said, as though history was like a railway timetable, that this train will come, then that train will come, etc. Of course, Marx was not doing that. In fact, when I teach about what Marx wrote about what Hobsbawm called pre-capitalist economic formations, my own understanding is that this writing that Marx did, which is quite interesting, was precisely anti-stagist, because classical political economy had already created stages. So in the minds of various writers, Scottish Enlightenment and so on, you had stages. You had hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, agriculture, and now we have this commercial system, as they called it. Marx actually broke that down, but he had a very interesting question that he asked. That he says, what has to happen before the conditions of capitalism are met? Because the conditions of capitalism are terribly brutal. They involve, as you will see in part 8, when you come to the question of the so-called primitive accumulation, Adam Smith thinks primitive accumulation, let me rephrase that. According to Adam Smith, says, if capital constantly invests money in order to get more money, and therefore to accumulate and to constantly accumulate, where did the original accumulation come from? So here clearly he has in mind some kind of heap of money, that, where did the original heap of money come from? And Marx says, this is nonsense. The real issue So this is the wrong question, because you are asking, then of course the answer is some people were thrifty, they saved money, they were virtuous, blah, blah, and, crap, etc. Marx says you're asking the wrong question. What creates the conditions for capitalism is not a heap of money, an object. It is a new relation between those who have been deprived of their access to the means of livelihood. They have been separated from the land, which was originally the means of livelihood for most people, and those who have appropriated said means of livelihood. Capital is a relation. And one of the simplest ways of understanding this, and people don't get it, it's like this. Imagine that, there was no free wage labor. Right? Everybody had their own access to their own livelihood, and they were happy to work on their own little land and make a decent living and so on. If there was no free wage labor, and imagine that an aunt of yours, you inherited from an old elderly aunt some huge mansion, and you think, oh, how wonderful, I have this huge mansion. But without people to employ, to clean it, to tend its gardens, to cook, to decorate, to etc., without people to employ, you will soon, it will be a burden on you. You may start out cleaning every room and thinking, I'm going to do this here and that there, but eventually you will shrink to one of its rooms which you can clean, manage on your own, and the rest will be left to decay as it pleases, because you cannot actually enjoy these vast properties without access to other people's labor, which you will appropriate at a relatively low price, which is their upkeep, and their upkeep is low because they are poor, etc., etc. So anyway, Marx says, what does it take for these conditions to obtain, where there is a substantial number of people who have no choice but to work for those people in whose hands property has ended up? So capital is a relation, because otherwise you can have heaps of money, mansions, huge fields and gardens and so on, but it will be no use to you without those people to work for you. That's the key point. And by the way, there are also historical examples. So the famous instance of Cecil Rhodes arriving in what is today Zimbabwe and essentially imposing a hut tax in order to compel members of an otherwise self-sufficient community to go out and work in the mines and plantations and so on in the colony. And if there was no hut tax, then nobody would have felt compelled. They had a good life, they had a good, decent means of livelihood, they were not poor, etc. But whereas you see, this is very important to emphasize, because the other thing is we so take it for granted that there is always a surplus of labor. Where did that surplus come from? And we will come back to it another time, because you see, but let me just bring it up now. There are 3 long chapters in Capital. One is on the working day, one is on machinery, and the third is entitled The General Law of Capital Accumulation, chapter 25. You'd think that the general law of capital accumulation would be full of these equations and how much capital you put in and how much comes out and under what condition and so on. And what do you find when you actually start reading it? It's about people. It's about the laws of population. And why is it about the laws of population? Why does Marx insist that every mode of production has its own laws of population? Because he is saying, folks, don't follow Malthus and assume that there are always poor people and that they're poor because they breed too much and blah, blah, and so on. Capitalism systematically generates this poverty. It requires this poverty even, and it requires the surfeit of people. Why? Because capitalism, it goes in ups and downs. When it needs labor, it sucks up every living individual that can possibly work, and even many of those who can barely do so. And then when it no longer leaves them, it expels them to do whatever they can to eke out whatever sort of living. But without this access to this reserve army, which is always there when capitalism needs it, it cannot function. So this sea of poor people that you see around you, if you do, or in the world, they are the kind of reserve that capital needs. It relies on. So there we go. Anyway, I probably am digressing, but yes, so we were talking about how historically distinct capitalism is, and capitalism is historically distinct in this fashion. In no other previously existing form of production have you had people systematically separated from their means of livelihood. And unless you defamiliarize yourself with that, the assumption that there are always poor people, it's like the ideology of our time. The poor will always be with us. And I forget who it is who says ideology's function is to make the unfamiliar familiar.
Right.
It is the function of science to make the familiar unfamiliar. And this is the other thing, that Marx is a scientist. That's why you will find at various points that you are asked to set aside this assumption of familiarity and see it for the unnatural thing that it is. And here's something else you get. Enlightenment thinkers have typically tended to see capitalism as natural and feudalism as artificial. And Marx's aim is to show that capitalism is the most unnatural system ever foisted upon humanity. So,
on a, I think, related note, and Marx touches upon it in Part 8, as you've mentioned, can you talk about the degree to which slavery and the transatlantic slave trade feeds into the birth and the early consolidation of capital?
Well, that's an interesting point, and it's a complex point because obviously Marx actually does talk about slavery at various places, but he tends to, he basically just talks about it in terms of saying that actually slavery tends to be less conducive to the development of the forces of production, because when you treat a human being as a brute, then you only get brute level of productivity from that person. And this is not a criticism, this is a criticism of the slave owners, not of the slaves. Anyway, so capital slavery, as far as I can remember, enters into capital chiefly in this way, in Capital Volume 1, chiefly in this way. But of course, if you think about the fact that, let me see. In order to understand how slavery is involved in the early development of capitalism, you have to defamiliarize something else. How is it possible for an entire industrial revolution to take place, which is based on a commodity that is not produced in that country, namely cotton? And it could only have been possible. The first suppliers of cotton to the mills of Manchester and elsewhere of Northern England were the slave-owning American South. And indeed, it's interesting that once the Civil War gets going and the supply of cotton is interrupted, that's when Britain starts looking for other sources of cotton. And so then Egypt and Sudan and these countries become part of this dragnet of capitalism. And then, of course, Western India, where cotton is the big crop, also enters into the production of cotton, because the cotton is no longer available from the United States. So in that sense, I would say that and Marx and Engels were totally were aware of this, right? So they are, and they, if they, people say that Marx and Engels' mechanisms of exploitation do not help us understand how slaves were exploited, but for Marx and Engels, the exploitation of slavery was obvious. That's why they were not trying to explain it. The only reason why they were trying to explain the exploitation of workers is because it was less obvious. And Marx had to go through himself several stages, this distinction that lies at the foundation of understanding the exploitation of workers in capital, which is the distinction between labor and labor power. It came to him, it took a while to come to him, right? Because he's puzzling, he's reading this stuff, he's puzzling over all this, and he is, working his way towards these understandings. So anyway, this distinction, so the reason why he's not explaining slavery or feudal oppression or whatever is not because he has something against the slaves or whatever. It's because it's obvious and it is forcible and it is contemptible that this exploitation takes place. as far as he's concerned.
Right, very interesting. One of the most enjoyable sections that I've read so far is on commodity fetishism, because he's just so ruthlessly making fun out of the theorists, the political economists up to date, who've ascribed all these fantastic properties onto objects, onto commodities, and presenting the whole economic structure as a relationship between objects, between things, in a way that he says this is essentially religious, and he demolishes that and demonstrates so clearly that it's a relationship between human beings. To what extent was he successful in changing the narrative on that? Does in terms of mainstream economics these days, has that been understood, or does commodity fetishism still prevail?
Neoclassical economics is the embodiment of commodity fetishism. So let's just get that out of the way. What really bugs me is that, I, for example, soon after coming to Winnipeg, there was a general agreement that we should start a capital reading group. So that would have been my third capital reading group or something. And of course, I was happy to do it. But so a group of us gathered, and then this colleague with whom I decided that we would lead it together, he stands up and talks about how fetishism is consumerism. And I'm just like, where can I even begin? If this guy who claims to know capital is saying this, then I just, and it was very difficult. And this is so common. It's just everywhere. They just commodity. It is not, yes, consumerism is a type of fetishism, but that is not what Marx is talking about. It's the German title is the fetish character die Waren. So it is a fetish character of commodities. And what he means by that, and if you read it, he says, the classical political economies, including the likes of Smith and Ricardo, do not ask the question why the products of labor take the form of commodities. And the only society in which the bulk of the product of labor takes the form of commodities is capitalism. Capital begins, the first sentence says, the wealth of all societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails takes the form of a huge heap of commodities or whatever, something like that, right? And this is what you have to ask. So that means that you have to distinguish it from previous societies. You have to distinguish, and also you have to distinguish the, people say, oh, this first chapter is so difficult. It's only difficult because you are trying to look at it through neoclassical economics eyes. Marx wants you to understand that there's a difference between use value and exchange value. Why? Because for him, it is the difference between labor and labor power. You can buy labor power on the market for its value, whatever it is, $10 a day, $100 a day, doesn't matter. Whatever it is, it's going value. But when you put it to work, when you use its use value, which is its capacity to work, it gives you far more than $100 worth or $10 worth. And you only do it because you know that difference exists. If I was a worker and you were a capitalist, and all I was able to produce in a day, however long the day was simply the worth of my own labor power, you would never employ me. Well, you're not running a charity shop. You're not, this is not a hobby for you. What's the point? The whole point is for me that that I can produce the worth of my own labor power in the first third of the day, and the rest of the 2/3 of the day I will spend producing more, and which you will appropriate as surplus value. So anyway, so Marx is saying, so what is the fetish character? It is of commodities, is that it is not recognizing the historical specificity of capitalism. This is what he berates people for. And also that the historical specificity and its particular modes of operation are embodied in this. And then he also says, even if you realize some of the truths that I'm saying, you will not be able to undo the fetishism. It's almost as though Marx is saying that because we have certain practices like employing labor and selling labor and producing commodities and selling them and so on, because we engage in these practices, the structures of our economic system secrete certain ideologies. And that is the fetish character of commodities. So, at one place, I was just something I emphasize, to my students is Marx says, men therefore do not bring the products of their labor into relation with each other as values because they see these objects merely as material integuments of homogeneous human labor. That is to say, they see that their private labor should become abstract social labor. The reverse, he says, is true. By equating their different products to each other in exchange as values, they equate their different types of labor as human labor. So it's what we do that has certain effects. And this is what Marx characterizes as the fetish character of commodities. And this existed in what he called the vulgar economy of his time. Although if you read the footnotes carefully, you will see that he also says that Ricardo is susceptible to this. Ricardo gets into all sorts of confusions because he does not understand the difference between used value and exchange value. He does not understand what is involved in the operation of generalized commodity production, etc., etc. So he is berating vulgar political economy of his time, but essentially what is neoclassical economics, but a systematization of what Marx berated as vulgar political economy. So that is why it's not, and remember also, this is one other thing about this consumerism business. It's not consumerism because you know what? Consumerism did not actually exist in Marx's time as a mass phenomenon. Most working class people had barely enough to eat. For them, more consumption was necessary. They were not living at a time when, oh, don't buy that extra car or that extra large house or whatever it is that consumerism or fast fashion or whatever. This was not the fate of the working class. Consumerism would have never entered into it. So I would say if you read it carefully, again, read what Marx is saying, not what David Harvey is telling you or Ben Fine is telling you, let alone anybody else. Read what Marx is saying. It is not hard. It is not at all hard. And you see in that section, if it were about consumerism, wouldn't he say so? Why does he talk about what would happen in primitive communism, what happens in feudalism, what happens in capitalism, and what might happen in socialism? Why are all these distinctions being made? It's because Marx is saying that we have to understand the distinct historical dynamics of capitalism, which are the dynamics of contradictory value production. And this is the key thing, we can, if we segue into what is in capital and what is not in capital, we would say that Marx has one single goal. He's not even trying to understand capitalism as a whole. Remember, Capital is an unfinished work. Only volume 1 was published. And if you read Mandel's introduction, he will also show you that there are all these other volumes that he hoped to write about world trade, about the state, about a whole bunch of different things. So it is an incomplete work. And in this first volume, his main purpose is to analyze value production, which he considers contradictory. And I would say that also, to me, the way I would understand contradictory value production is that it has two axes along which contradictions occur. One is what I would call the vertical axis of exploitation. Capitalists extract surplus value from labor. The other is a horizontal axis of competition. There is competition between capitalists. And here I would also add one other thing, because in volume 3, he goes into great detailed discussion of how surplus value gets distributed, because it's not just a question of an individual capitalist extracting surplus value. All these capitalists are operating in a system, and they are competing with one another. Plus, they have to reckon with the power of two other types of property in land and property in money. So how are profits distributed? How much remains as profit with the capitalists? How much goes to money owners as interest? And how much goes to landowners as rent? So this triangular distribution is determined not by any mechanism but political struggle between different types of owners of assets, right? So capitalists, landowners, and money capitalists, or money owners, whatever you want to call them, money lenders, perhaps. So this horizontal mechanism, competition between capitalists determines, for example, that although there may be two capitalists producing the same commodity, the less efficient capitalists will, the system will ensure that the less efficient capitalists will keep less of the profits, and the more efficient capitalists will appropriate more of the profits. Imagine we are all producing shoes. In the shoe producing sector, this is what will happen, right? Similarly, in other sectors of production, and also broadly eventually. Anyway, so the point is that there are these two elements, and both of these are contradictory, because, and the other way I like to put it as well is, too much of the discussion of Marx tends to get technicized, especially because of what I will later call Marxist economics. Oh, there is this equation and that equation. Actually, if you read Capital, there's hardly any equation in it. And there are a few arithmetical sums in volume 2, but that's really about it. So to come back to this, it gets technicized. So what is this horizontal and vertical? The horizontal is the injustice of capitalism. Yes, I know Marx was not being moralistic, etc., but it is an injustice, and let's just call it that, okay, bearing in mind all those nice things that Marx said. And the other is the anarchy of capitalism. So capitalism is an unjust and an anarchic system, and these two dynamics of and these are, the value production is the core of that, because capitalism is historically distinct in the sense that it aims at the production of value in the abstract. In every other economy, we are producing shirts and cheese and milk and grain and houses and so on. Capitalism is the only economy in which we are producing only value, something abstract called value. And this value it may appear to be hard to understand, but essentially it is the abstract. It is essentially an abstraction. It's not the shoe, it is not the house, it is not the shirt, but it is that element of labor that is involved in all of them. But after the mechanisms of surplus extraction and competition have done their work, it is socially necessary labor embodied in any commodity. Because what happens? You have surplus extraction, but then only competition drives the prices of things down to their socially necessary level, to their value, right? So both of these are necessary. Both of these are contradictory for reasons that I have just said. It is unjust and anarchic. And so this is the core mechanism of value production, and that's what capital concentrates on. But Marx is very aware that capitalism is more than just this, that it, for example, for value production to take place anywhere, you need to have a certain social structure, certain political structure, certain forms of money, certain forms of blah, blah, etc. So all these conditions have to be secured. So, and where am I taking all this? I'm taking all this in the following direction. A lot of writers who call themselves Marxist economists write about a purely capitalist economy, completely forgetting that Marx and Engels never believed that such an economy would ever come into existence. Engels even said, we revolutionaries will not let it come to that. Because every capitalist society is born in a pre-capitalist context. It is born, it always fails to not only does it fail to transform them entirely, in fact, rather than transforming them, it uses them. It will use the structures of patriarchy, racism, etc., to draw extra surplus value, etc., etc. And also it will use various forms of privilege, etc. And then it will create its own forms of its own forms of structures that are required to keep it in place. Central banking today is not capitalist. It is a service provided to capital. central banking were capitalist, it would not function. Capitalism could not function. So certain non-capitalist conditions have to be provided so that capitalism can function in this form. And they are never fully provided. There is always a difficulty in securing these conditions, and that also creates capitalist crises. Anyway, I'm perhaps taking you in a different direction, but there it is. So in terms of what is in capital, capital only has that. If Marx had had the time to write about all these other things, he would have written about them. He would have shown that capitalism is never pure and will never be pure and cannot be pure because it's contradictory. It always requires the intervention of some other force, the state usually, to stabilize it through one kind of prop or another, which then becomes part of that capitalism. So that's why you also have to think of capitalism historically. Another big distinction between neoclassical economics and classical political economy is that classical political economy and Marx thought historically. Neoclassical economics has no notion of history. It has absolutely no notion of history. So anyway, so that's what's in capital. Where does surplus value, what is value? Where does surplus value come from? How is surplus value extracted? You know, what's that? Absolute surplus value, relative surplus value, etc., etc. And then there are, you know, the struggle over the working day, etc. But this is the core of it. And, you know, the secret of primitive accumulation or the original accumulation, etc. But this is the core, and this is what it would take to make capitalism function, if at all. Remember, because it's always touch and go. And of course, today we live in a time where all those surrounding conditions have undergone a decade undergone a century and a half of further mutation, with the further debility of capitalism as a form of production. So that, in fact, if you think about it, you may, and people are beginning to make this argument, or they have been making this argument for some time, that of course we live in a period of time when capitalism has acquired great senility. It has become senile. And as a consequence, we are living in insofar as we maintain capitalist legal relations and so on, we are maintaining a senile and rentier form of capitalism, which is why you see this huge bubble of finance and so on and so forth. So,
right. Very interesting. That feeds into one thing I wanted to ask you about, actually, which was that Marx sort of recognized that in spite of its contradictions and terrible inequalities and the poverty and the misery that it created, capitalism also obviously has this very important progressive aspect, you know, in the sense that on the one hand, you have a concentration of capital, unprecedented concentration of capital, and then competition and the producer's obsession about turning M into M dash by any means necessary drove unprecedented steps forward in science and technology and productivity, thereby creating at least the possibility for extraordinary improvements in human living conditions. Does capitalism still retain any of that progressive aspect?
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to say that, so I'm going to answer that in two parts. So first, even in the heyday of competitive, innovative capitalism did this exist. And I would like to say that, first of all, from Marx's point of view, remember that in 1848, Marx and Engels thought that capitalism could be defeated right there and then. So they were not waiting for it to develop any further. And remember that there already are those paeans to how they revolutionize the forces of production and all that, that lionization of the bourgeoisie in the first chapter, which is all some people read. They don't read the rest, which is a problem. But anyway, so it's there, but they still don't think that this is a price worth paying for the misery that it causes. That socialism, remember that Marx and Engels thought socialism would develop the forces of production even more. This is a point which a lot of people who call themselves Marxist economists forget. They actually do not take a Marxist view of capitalism. They take what I call a Schumpeterian view of capitalism, which is also an ironic statement because, quite frankly, Schumpeter's theory of innovation was not so much a theory, but merely just a claim that capitalism was inherently innovative, which is balderdash. And if you look at some of the recent literature in the field of innovation studies, they have all emphasized the extent to which capitalism has relied on the state to produce its greatest innovations. Okay, so I would say, and also if you look at the hash that capitalist firms and corporations make of the whole process of innovation, where, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, it's far easier to produce Viagra or a few little slightly modified tablets so that you can keep your patents going for a longer time, which really do not result in any real increase in welfare for people. If you look at these trends, you will see that actually to attribute to capitalism great innovation is a mistake. Yes, it's true that there is some element of competition that leads to certain progressive force, certain progress, etc. But if insofar as it existed, it was long gone. The second thing I'd like to say is that when people look at the wealth of first world societies today and say, oh, look what capitalism can do, not only are they forgetting the extent to which the state has subsidized innovation of practically every kind. You look at any major thing you admire, whether it's the internet or major pharmaceuticals or whatever it is the state that has played a very big role. But the other thing people are forgetting is, folks, this part of the world is rich and prosperous because of imperialism much more than innovation. So let's bear that in mind. Okay, so the wealth of first world societies cannot be used to explain the Promethean character of capitalism, I think. And remember that not only did Marx and Engels actually want, even though they recognized that there was some element of this in capitalism, they wanted to extinguish capitalism already in 1848. But also by the end of his life, Marx came to the conclusion that insofar as it's possible at all, the rest of the world should be spared the misery of going through capitalism, like what he said about Russia, for example. So in all of these ways, I think that it is very important to take less seriously this Schumpeterian lionization of capitalism, chiefly by Marxists who are too influenced by neoclassical economics. And remember that capitalism is an extremely costly system in human terms. And ultimately, human terms, who are the producers? Human beings are the producers. And so you are costing production. You are costing innovation. It's human beings who innovate and produce, right? So not capitalism. So if you are putting a great cost on, if you are burdening human beings with the burdens of capitalism, then you are actually stopping innovation. I should just like to say one other thing here. Because of the influence of neoclassical economics, there has been this Marxist economics, which we will talk about, I hope we'll talk about in a little while. But I'd like to say one thing, and that is that has led to many Marxist economists either denying that there are no economic contradictions in capitalism, or that one or other of the major contradictions that Marx had pointed to did not exist. Either Marx did not, for example, they say Marx did not believe that there was a demand problem. And I have shown chapter and verse that he did, in beginning with Grundrisse, volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, etc. And the second is that the rate of profit does not fall. Again, that has been refuted by beginning with Mandel and by many other people, time and time again. And Alan Freeman, Andrew Kleinman, and others have, of course, done it in their own way, and they have shown some very interesting things about profit rates and so on. So, and this kind of thing comes because of, but the thing is, because of the intervention of neoclassical economics, Marx is very clear that capitalism is contradictory. It is prone to crisis. It is costly. It is burdensome, and it almost always, and so many things have to go right for it to function at all, that it almost never functions as it is supposed to function.
Very interesting. And it's a bit of a tangent, but in relation to what you were saying about the state involvement in innovation, do you recommend people to read Matsukato's work on that?
Absolutely, and she's not the only one. Lately, of course, absolutely, but there's been a whole host of writings about the involvement of the state in innovation. If you like, I can look it up, but I have been reading it. Since I'm not working on the subject, I sort of didn't retain in my memory the writers and the titles of these books, but there is a lot of work out there. So yeah.
And I mean, I should let you go quite soon, but it'd be great if, and it's a tall order, but are you able to sort of map out or give a basic overview of the state of Marxist economics as it is in 2021?
So yeah, so I'd like to say, as starting off the bat, that I'm going to criticize all of Marxist economics. But by that, I do not mean that I'm going to criticize every individual Marxist economist. I have worked with a lot of them. I like, and I would probably be on 99.9% of demonstrations and marches with all of them. So we agree on all of this. However, I do want to insist, and I've written quite a few works on this. If you like, I can send them to you. I do want to insist that there's something fundamentally wrong about the interaction, about trying to fit what Marx did into a neoclassical framework. Let me just begin at the beginning. So neoclassical economics emerges in the form of marginalist revolution circa 1890. Already by the 1870, already by the 1880s, there are people like Tugan Baranovsky, for example, one of the Russian legal Marxists, who is already putting forward the main propositions of what I consider to be what is wrong with so-called Marxist economics. And so he is saying that Marx's value analysis does not work because he cannot translate values into prices, especially when it involves the use of substantial amounts of capital. How does value really emerge from labor, when, etc. So, and this is an old problem. And I have shown in my own writing that it was Ricardo's problem. It is not Marx's problem. And part of the reason why all of this is happening is because the neoclassical revolution reaches back. One of my writings, I have a section subtitled Ricardo versus Ricardo, because there's the Ricardo who says that all value comes from labor, who is the Ricardo we all love. And then there's the Ricardo who agrees that with Say's law, and who proposes the idea of comparative advantage, both of which are terribly wrong notions. So neoclassical economics reaches out to the latter. So Ricardo is sort of, brought out from the dead and sort of dusted off to do further service. But of course, then Marxists pick up on another Ricardo, but then they repeat his mistakes. And they fail to see that Marx solved these mistakes. And by the way, they fail to see it precisely because they're trying to spend their time fitting Marx into neoclassical economics. The funny thing is, I was just for a completely different reason, having nothing to do with my work on Marx, I ended up reading Ferdinand Tönnies' Community and Society. And you'd be amazed to know, not only did this guy think Marx was the bee's knees, but he has, in a page and a half, he systematically dispenses with the notion that there is any problem with Marx's value analysis. In perfectly lucid, no mathematical language terms, he simply sees what the issue is, and he could understand it, but others could not. Because you see, Bukharin, who comes along later to criticize this, he says that basically, Bukharin and Hilferding did resist neoclassical economics, each in their own way, and again, I've written about this, but Bukharin says that most other Marxists were pursuing a policy of theoretical reconciliation. And the result of that policy of theoretical reconciliation is Marxism. So they do at least three things that I think are deeply problematic. They say that the transformation problem is Marx's rather than Ricardo's, and therefore then essentially, if there is a transformation problem, let's throw out capital. There's no point reading it. The value analysis does not work. It's wrong. Don't waste your time reading capital. Okay, so that's the first thing they say. And then they try, of course, then they spend how many trees have been felled to publish the books that in which Marxists give one ingenious resolution to the transformation problem after another. But Marx does not need it. Maybe they do, but Marx does not need it. So just read Marx if you want to sidestep the whole thing. And if you have gotten into the whole debate, then read Andrew Kleiman and Alan Freeman's works, and you will be soon sorted out from that problem if you went that far into it. But I would say you don't even need to go that far. So that's the first thing. And then they say, there is no demand problem. There is no tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Indeed, there are no economic contradictions because neoclassical economics and its equilibrium forms of working, this is what they get used to. So these are all wrong. And what's more, it also makes you fail to understand what value really is. And I'll tell you this, I was talking to a very prominent Marxist economist, just over a drink before a conference, etc. And I'm not going to name names, but he said to me, I don't understand value. I don't understand value. Okay. And he is not a spring chicken. Okay. He's considerably older than me, shall we say. Okay. So what I want to say is it makes you unable to understand value because, and this is also quite important, and I'll end with this for now. What is a commodity? A commodity that is something that is produced for sale, and under capitalist conditions, its prices are brought down to the level of socially necessary labor, etc. So a commodity is something which has a cost of production, and its price is generally determined by its cost of production, not because the producer is so kind that he's selling it to you for cost of production, but because the forces of competition put downward pressure on prices until they cannot go down any further. And that is the point at which this is, it has to be this at the current technological level until something changes. Okay, so that's what capitalism does. That's why commodities are valued at cost of production. Neoclassical economics confuses, because by focusing only on demand and supply, it confuses the price mechanisms of pricing assets with the price mechanisms of pricing commodities. In fact, it doesn't even know the difference between these two. So a share has the same price mechanisms as a newly produced pair of shoes, but they don't, because the one is an asset. It is not, maybe a share is in any case not produced for sale, but even if it is some asset that was once produced for sale, like a fine painting or a fine bottle of wine, the time when it was priced by cost of production is gone. It is now priced as an asset, right? And that is indeed formed only by demand and supply. But in the case of commodities, the cost of production forms a floor under which they will try to push it, but it will not go. Okay, so this is the key. And so I worked on Karl Polanyi quite a bit, and he has this notion that land, labor, and money are fictitious commodities. And most today Polanyi scholars, and even people like Philip Mirowski, for example, I quote him. Philip Mirowski makes fun of Polanyi. Says this guy doesn't understand commodities, and he thinks of commodities in moral terms. No, Philip, you are wrong. But classical political economy knew very well that land, labor, and money were not commodities, because. And what was the dead giveaway? They didn't use that language, but what was the dead giveaway? They knew that their prices were formed by special laws, which were not the laws by which commodities were priced. So, and by the time Polanyi comes along, it is important, and in fact, it is Tönnies. That's why I was reading Tönnies. It's Tönnies who needs to insist that these are fictitious commodities, because between Marx and Tönnies, neoclassical economics has come along and said everything that is bought and sold is a commodity. And they said, not so fast. There are some things. We don't have babies because they will become commodities. They will become labor power. We don't, nobody produced the land even. It's just there. It is the common heritage of humankind, but we commodify it. And money is essentially a debt relation, whether it is between the government and us or it is between private creditors and us. But it's a debt relation, it's a social relation, it's a political relation above all. But it is not a commodity. Yes, capitalism wants to impose commodification on all these three, but it has extremely complex and contradictory consequences. And if you don't understand that that is so, you will fail to understand a large part of what a capitalist economy is and what is wrong with it.
Right, very interesting. I just need to ask one last question for the sake of the reading group. Let's suppose we're all good little boys and girls and we read our 10, 15 pages a day and we make our way through volume 1. We go back over the chapter on money because it's quite difficult to understand. What's the next project after that? Must you go straight on to volume 2?
I would say certainly go on to volume 2, but I would also say some other things. for example, it may be, if you want to take breathers between volumes, for example, you could go back and read some of the pamphlets, the early pamphlets, Value, Price and Profit, Wage, Labor and Capital, etc. You could read those. I think also before reading volume 3, particularly, you may want to read Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which was, I think, 1857 or 1858, so a decade before Capital. Grundrisse is worth reading, but above all, you may want to, I know this is like a huge thing to ask for, but there are the 3 volumes of Theories of Surplus Value. And I would say that they are about the best history of political economy that you get, because Marx represents a sort of culmination and he's writing it. They are his notes, and they contain a lot of really important and interesting points, which are, and they are less heavy because, you know, they are written as notes, so they are less heavy to absorb. And you can dip into it. For example, if you say, well, what is Marx really saying about Ricardo? Then read the sections on Ricardo, or read the sections on Malthus, or read the sections on Smith, or other writers, as you may see fit. You can dip into it, or you can just read from cover to cover. But there will also be those things. So really, it's up to you how you and how much work you want to do. But about volume 2 in particular, I would say that you should also make sure that I hope you're not missing the Mandel introductions, because the Mandel introduction will familiarize you with a lot of the misuses to which volume 2 in particular has been put. It's so-called reproduction schemas and all that. Right.
Amazing. I should let you go. We've been
okay. Well, it's been a long one, so I hope good luck with editing it. But I warned you that I have a lot to say about all of these different things. This is something I've worked on. That's partly why. So, but thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. And
look, I really want to thank you for giving up so much of your time and for
no worries,
condensing so much insight into the talk.